Oh, yeah, there's a real pecking order to this front row, I've learned. I've seen some of you get booted out if you sit in what other reporters think are the wrong seats. So, Abby, welcome to the front row. If I had my choice, I'd say you're welcome there anytime. Many of you, just go on up and grab a seat. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a couple of announcements I'd like to make at the top before taking your questions. But first, I'd like to address a serious situation that happened last night, overnight, and I spoke with some of you over the phone last night about this very thing. And that is what happened at our U.S. Embassy in Montenegro. The U.S. Embassy in Montenegro is working closely with the law enforcement officers there regarding the attack on our embassy compound shortly after midnight on Thursday, February the 22nd. We can confirm that the assailant was killed at the scene, apparently by his own explosive. I'll refer you to the Montenegrin law enforcement officers for questions regarding the investigation itself because they are handling that. Our embassy has no indication that the attack is part of an ongoing threat, although the investigation continues into the motives of the assailant. Out of an abundance of caution, consular operations have been closed for the day today, although the U.S. Embassy remains open for emergency services for U.S. citizens. For Friday, February 23rd, the consular section will continue to be open for emergency services only. Visa appointments canceled today will be rescheduled in the near future. The United States wants to express its gratitude for the close cooperation with our ally and longstanding partner, the government of Montenegro. We want to thank local law enforcement officials for their quick response on the scene and their professionalism for the ongoing investigation. The U.S. Embassy has no changes to its standing travel advisory, instructing U.S. citizens to exercise normal precautions when visiting Montenegro. For more information, you can go to travel.state.gov.
Was there anyone actually in the embassy when this happened?
Well, we typically have people in post at our post 24/7.
Other than security.
Other than security, that I'm not aware of. Second issue, I'd like to address something that took place in Ukraine. And as many of you know, our Deputy Secretary was just in Ukraine yesterday. I'd like you to turn your attention to that matter where Russia continues to perpetuate a conflict that has now claimed more than 10,000 lives. Yesterday, we received new reports that a 23-year-old Ukrainian medic was killed while he was trying to aid civilians near the line of contact. The incident is a reminder that the conflict in eastern Ukraine continues to rage on. Civilians and first responders face real dangers every day. It's also worth repeating that Russia manufactured this conflict in 2014 and continues to control its proxy forces in Donbass. Russia has demonstrated repeatedly that it can stop the violence whenever it chooses. The United States once again calls on Russia to order its proxy forces to implement a complete ceasefire, to withdraw its forces and heavy weapons from eastern Ukraine, and to agree to a robust UN peacekeeping mission. I mentioned our Deputy Secretary was just there, and I'd like to read a quote from an address that he gave yesterday in Kiev. Quote, given the high stakes, it's important to be clear about U.S. policy toward the conflict. Crimea is Ukraine. The Donbass is Ukraine. We will never accept trading one region of Ukraine for another. We will never make a deal about Ukraine without Ukraine. I just mentioned the Deputy Secretary's travel, so I'd like to give you a bit of a readout on some of the places that he's visited so far. He arrived in Kiev on Tuesday evening and on Wednesday morning toured the Heavenly 100 Memorial and the War Dead Wall of Honor, which memorialized those who lost their lives during the 2014 Euromaidan protests and thousands of soldiers who died as a result of Russia's aggression in eastern Ukraine. While in Kiev, he held meetings with the foreign minister, the prime minister, and also President Poroshenko, with whom he discussed the importance of Ukraine continuing to implement reforms, in particular, establishing an independent anti-corruption court, as well as the United States' support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He also gave a public speech at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Diplomatic Academy to underline the United States' commitment to stand behind Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. And he also pressed Ukraine's leaders to redouble their efforts on critical reforms and renew their commitment to weed out corruption. Earlier today in Latvia, the Deputy Secretary held meetings with the President, the Foreign Minister. He congratulated Latvia on celebrating 100 years of independence in 2018 and announced President Trump's invitation to host a U.S.-Baltic Centennial Summit on April 3rd this year. He also reiterated the U.S. commitment to NATO's Article 5. He expressed appreciation for Latvia fulfilling its NATO defense investment pledge from the Wales summit and discussed threats facing the transatlantic community, including corruption and U.S. support of Latvian efforts to establish a well-regulated banking sector. Later, he joined a group of U.S. and Latvian soldiers and children from a local orphanage for a tour of a local museum. Tomorrow, he'll be in Brussels, where he will lead a U.S. delegation to participate in a G5 Sahel Donors Conference to discuss the support of development, security, and political goals in the Sahel. And finally, I'd like to bring your attention to Africa and something that took place in Nigeria. We're still trying to get all the details about that, but I wanted to mention that we condemn in the strongest possible terms the terror attack on a school earlier this week in northeastern Nigeria. The choice of targets, including schools, markets, and places of worship, reflect the brutality of terror organizations. The victims in the attack were girls who were simply seeking an education. We want to extend our condolences to the students and to their families affected by these terrorist attacks and are concerned that some of the students are still not accounted for. We continue to support Nigerian efforts to counter the terror groups. We also support Nigerian efforts to enable more than 2 million displaced in the Lake Chad region to return home safely. The United States continues to provide humanitarian assistance to those who are affected by the violence. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thanks. I want to start in Syria.
Okay.
In both the Damascus suburbs and up north in Afrin. I'm just wondering, and at the developments at the UN, such as they are.
Okay.
Do you have anything new to say about the situation in eastern Ghouta today, where attacks seem to be continuing, first of all?
I think this is a good reminder as we watch what has unfolded in eastern Ghouta over the past few days. More than 400 or so civilians have been horrifically killed by the Syrian regime. And as we all know, they're backed by not only Russia, but also Iran. It is a good reminder that Russia bears a unique responsibility for what is taking place there. Without Russia backing Syria, the devastation and the deaths would certainly not be occurring. This also brings to light something that we have discussed many times, but although not recently, and that is also the Astana talks, the Astana progress or process. And that was something a lot of you asked questions about. You know, where are you on Astana? Is the United States participating in Astana? Is Astana a good thing? This shows the failure of the Astana process. And that is precisely why the United States government and so many other nations stand by the Geneva process as the best way forward to eventually bring peace and eventually bring about a political solution in Syria. Now remember, what Astana was about, Russia and Iran were guarantors for that. They developed de-escalation zones. One of those de-escalation zones was eastern Ghouta. So much for that de-escalation zone. They have starved people there. They have prevented humanitarian aid from getting in. We have seen innocent civilians killed. We've seen barrel bombs. We've seen this devastation and destruction. That is certainly no de-escalation zone. They can get back to trying to create a de-escalation zone, but we want them to get back to the Geneva process, and it shows what a farce this de-escalation zone has become.
So both the conflicts then, from what you just said, in both Ukraine and Syria are all Russia's fault. Is that the idea?
Not all Russia's fault, but Russia is a guarantor of Astana. We've talked about this many times before, that Bashar al-Assad was back on his heels. And in 2015, Russia came in, swooped in, and saved him. Now we see reports of Russian military, potentially, although I can't confirm this, coming in to provide additional air equipment to bolster the Syrian regime once again. We would say that Russia is certainly responsible for enabling.
Okay.
Enabling is what they're doing.
And then up north in the Afrin area, in your comments about Ukraine, you took note of the 20-something-year-old who was killed. Mm-hmm. There's a situation, there's some video out now of FSA troops killing a civilian farmer, apparently, stealing his tractor. I'm just wondering if if you have any comment on that. These are your partners up there. Do you have any comment on that? And also, do you have any comment on just the broader situation with the Turks?
To your first question about video, I've not seen that video, so I'm not aware of it. I'm not familiar with that situation that you're describing, so I can't comment on that. Overall, as you all well know, we are not operating in Afrin. We don't have U.S. forces on the ground there, so we don't have a whole lot of visibility in terms of what is going on in Afrin. We continue to have conversations with the Turkish government. The Secretary had constructive meetings with his counterpart, as well as with the President of Turkey last week, in which we talked about how we both agree that we need to get back to the focus on ISIS. What is going on in Afrin is taking away from the fight against ISIS. It is a distraction, as Secretary Mattis had called it. It is certainly not helpful to have people take their eye off the ball of ISIS. We've talked about that numerous times before. Some of the forces that we are working with in the East, and as a reminder, we are there to fight ISIS. That's exactly why we're in Syria. Some of the forces that we're working with in the East, we are seeing starting to go to Afrin. They have familial relations, familial ties there. Perhaps that's part of the reason why. That, again, becomes a distraction because we can no longer fight ISIS the way that we would fully like to be able to do that when we do have that type of distraction. So in terms of who is operating there, Matt, I can't get into any of those details, but what I can say is that the more participants that get involved in that region, the far more complicated this entire situation becomes. The further we get from being able to solve this this crisis and to solve the situation there.
Okay, last one. When the Secretary was in Ankara, as you know, he announced that, or both he and the Foreign Minister announced the creation of this working group.
Yes.
That's supposed to meet by the mid-March or before mid-March, which is rapidly approaching. As you know, February is a short month. And I'm just wondering, it's been almost a week since that announcement was made. Are you aware of any, has that progressed at all towards scheduling an actual meeting of this working group?
Well, we have people we have our colleagues who are in touch with the Turkish government every day, not just on the ground in Turkey, but also here at the State Department. So they're working to set up some times and dates and locations for those meetings. I don't have anything to announce formally at this point, but I can tell you that we are in touch with them to have conversations about when exactly those meetings will be held and what the topics of the meeting will be. It'll be a mechanism, and all the specifics of what the Secretary and what his counterpart agreed to will be further defined.
Thanks.
Could you comment? Do you have any comment on the apparent coordination in Afrin between your allies and the Syrian government forces?
No.
You don't have any comment on that?
And here, and let me go back to this once again, because we are not operating there, so we are limited. We are limited in terms of what we can say about the situation in Afrin. I mean, certainly, all of this going on, the conflict that is going on, is taking the fight away, taking the emphasis off the entire reason that the United States is there, and that is for the defeat of ISIS.
Okay, my question: do you frown upon the apparent cooperation between your allies, the Kurdish forces, and the Syrian region?
I think you're trying to pin me into a corner, and I'm not going to step into that corner.
And one last question regarding the 30-day ceasefire. I think that is being discussed at the UN.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention that too.
Yeah. Could you update us what is happening with that? Is that something that you would support, and on a 30-day interval, so to speak, all throughout the country or in East Ghouta?
We would very much like to see this 30-day ceasefire that is being discussed at the United Nations. We put out a statement a couple days ago in which we called for that ceasefire. That is the only way we could start to get supplies and humanitarian aid into eastern Ghouta to try to help the people there. That has not yet come to fruition. We will continue to call for that and to put pressure on that. I would urge all of you as journalists, there's no one who has a bigger megaphone than each of you. I know many news organizations are interested in other things right now. I know you all are passionate about foreign affairs. You're all passionate about world events and humanitarian situations across the world. There is no better advocate for what is going on and shining a spotlight on the horrors that are taking place in eastern Ghouta than each of you. If I can implore you, and I know you do this anyway as part of your jobs, talking to your editors, talking to your producers, saying this is important, this is something we've got to cover, now is the time to cover it. So many people have come to us saying, what is the United States doing about the situation in eastern Ghouta? What can we do? The answer to that is we can shine a spotlight on that. That is what I'm attempting to do right now. That is what the government is attempting to do. And I hope you will be a part of that, shining the spotlight on that. I want to thank Elise last night. She had included me in seeing a documentary I'm not supposed to encourage people to go see things or do some things, but I don't care. I'm going to break that rule because I think it's just that important. A documentary last night called The Last Men in Aleppo, and it was about the situation in Aleppo, Syria. And in there, you saw the humanitarian disaster. You saw these selfless men who were leaving their families every day to go try to save those who were buried in the rubble or who had been victims of attacks. That situation is being replicated today in eastern Ghouta. We don't have to see this happen this way. Shine a spotlight on it. Let the world know exactly what is happening. We will back you in this. I will assist you in any way I can in helping you to shine a spotlight on this important issue. Elise, go right ahead. And I'd also like to mention one of your other colleagues who moderated the panel yesterday from Al Arabiya. So she did a great job.
Point well taken, and thank you. I'm just wondering specifically what Secretary Tillerson is doing to try and negotiate some kind of, you talked about the failure of the Astana process, but it's obvious that the kind of Geneva process has lost its way as well.
Well, the Geneva process hasn't lost its way, and here's why. There are so many countries who have signed on to the Geneva process.
But the Geneva process is something like in terms of working towards a political transition, specifically in terms of trying to negotiate some kind of ceasefire or some kind of new de-escalation zone. Specifically, what is the Secretary doing to try and alleviate the situation?
Well, first I can tell you we have regular meetings in Jordan and with the Jordanians as we review our ceasefire zone in southwestern Syria. Remember, that's the one that's worked. That's the one that the United States put together with the Jordanians and a handful of other countries on this de-escalation zone, ceasefire zone. That's held since July. Okay, that is a terrific model. If we could get that model elsewhere in other parts of the country, we not only think that that would save lives, but help bring in humanitarian aid and help to better settle the situation. That's one of the things we need to do. The Secretary just had a meeting, of course, with the Turks, as you well know. The Secretary has meetings and conversations with many of our partners and allies all around the world to discuss this situation.
But specifically, when it came time, when we were talking in terms of Aleppo,
yeah.
A lot of the negotiations were between the State Department and the Russians. And, you know, I know there's a new Secretary of State, but, you know, specifically the Russians are the ones that not only are in some ways, you know, parties to what's going on there, but also
conversations with the Russian government and reach out to the Russian government to implore them to stop enabling the Syrian regime to do what it's doing to its own people. Is Russia listening? I'm not sure that they are. But I would encourage each of you to ask Russia, take these questions to Vladimir Putin, take these questions to RT, to Sputnik, ask them those very questions. What are they doing to stop the devastation, the deaths, and the murders that are taking place in Syria? I'd be curious to hear their answers. They could do a lot more. They certainly bear a unique responsibility. We'd like to see them do more.
Well, are you considering any more action at the UN Security Council? I mean, what is the, you know, diplomatic path forward in terms of trying to negotiate an end to this? Because whether the Russians are, you know, a party to it or they're just supporting the Syrians, clearly they're the power brokers in terms of the influence.
Well, they have their weapons. They have their personnel down there that are participating in this. I have a list of 11 UN actions that Russia has blocked, specifically on Syria. Right here, I'd be happy to share a copy with all of you. Russia needs to cut this out. The Secretary has made that clear. The Secretary put out a statement. The White House put a statement out just last night on this. This is something we are following carefully. Russia needs to step up. Russia needs to cut it out.
I hear you, but beyond kind of statements and, you know, asking them, are there, you know, is the Secretary going to go meet with Foreign Minister Lavrov and try and negotiate something? I mean, we saw with Secretary Kerry, a lot of those efforts, you know, did not bear fruit, but there was a hearty effort in terms of trying to
I don't think
negotiate.
that anyone could argue that we have not made very strong efforts, stronger efforts, many would argue, than the previous administration on the issue of dealing with Syria. And that is, we've talked about that many times before. So the Secretary is fully committed to this. This is something that he is highly focused on, and the conversations and the diplomatic discussions will not stop. But I'm not going to be able to read out every single diplomatic discussion or conversation that takes place on
Well,
this.
could you just, I mean, can you at least, characterize what his discussions with Foreign Minister Lavrov in the last week have been on this issue?
Elise, I'm not going to pin the secretary down to reading out all of the diplomatic conversations.
Well, is he talking to the Russian foreign minister about
we
it?
are having lots of conversations with many other countries. We are calling out Russia for its responsibility that it has. I would encourage you to also ask these very same questions of the Russian government. What is it doing to try to prevent the deaths of civilians in Syria? The secretary is committed to this, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
Well, if you could take the question, because specifically, no.
I'm sorry, what is the question?
The question is specifically, what are the discussions with the Russians right now about trying to negotiate an end to this? Because I'm not saying that there are.
I'm not sure that they are, based on their actions, I don't think that they appear to be interested in ending this. However, I will go back and point to the president and Vladimir Putin's joint statement that they put out in Vietnam late last year, and that is where they agreed to the Geneva process. Let me go back and quote some of this for you as soon as I can find it. The presidents agreed that there is no military solution to the conflict in Syria. They confirmed that the ultimate political solution to the conflict must be forged through the Geneva process pursuant to UNSCR 2254. They also took note of President Assad's recent commitment to the Geneva process and constitutional reform and elections as called for under UNSCR 2254. Okay, those are commitments that the Russians made. They've not lived up to those commitments.
Okay, the question, if you could take it, is beyond, having conversations with partners and allies, specifically what is being done today.
At least I'm not going to have an answer for you on that because the secretary continues to have conversations. Some of those are private diplomatic conversations with the Russian government and with other governments as well. That is my answer. Okay. Anything else on this issue?
The previous administration also tried this tactic of calling Russia out and saying they're on the wrong side of history, they're not doing it, and it had zero impact. In fact, when it started in 2014 or even earlier, it turned into a full-scale military operation from Russia in 2015, as you noted. So, what makes you think this time this administration's calling out of Russia is going to make the situation any better?
Matt, I don't know what some of you expect us to do. We have a full range of options through the interagency that are available to us if we want to or if we should need to use those. Our best tool, what we do out of this building, is an attempt at diplomacy, an attempt to shine a spotlight on things that are taking place around the world. That's what I'm doing. That's what many of my colleagues are doing all around the globe right now. We will continue to do that. We will continue to take action at the UN Security Council. We will continue to have our people there on the ground, frankly. We have Americans who are there who are assisting Syrians try to get back to a normal life. I don't know what more you expect us to do. You have seen this government, this administration, go hard after ISIS. They have done that at a level that the previous administration did not do. We are succeeding there in the fight against ISIS, okay? And that is the whole reason why we're there. And then there's this other issue,
no,
right?
That's not the whole reason why this conflict started. I'm sorry.
No, I said the reason we are there is to defeat ISIS. That is the reason that U.S. forces are there. That is the U.S. government policy. You may disagree with that, but that is what our policy is. We're there to defeat ISIS. Okay?
No one's saying that you didn't make significant efforts and progress even in defeating ISIS. The question on the table is, what are the diplomatic efforts that this administration
is described?
You haven't. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry you disagree with me. Okay, I would encourage you to go talk to the Russian government and see what they're trying to do to save some lives.
Heather, can I just turn that, just flip it slightly? If the U.S. mission is to defeat ISIS, is that another way of saying it's not the mission to deal with the violence and that this is Russia's responsibility?
No,
which you've
Russia
stressed?
has a unique responsibility.
But
Russia
does the
has
US
a unique
have
responsibility when Russia has air assets in the air.
Does the U.S.
when
see it as
Russia
part of
is
its mission?
bolstering the government of Bashar al-Assad, they have a responsibility. We are not providing weapons and material to the government of Bashar al-Assad. We are not aiding in the killing of innocent civilians as Bashar al-Assad is doing.
Does the
our
US
forces are
think it
there
has a
in the east, and
responsibility
our
to help
forces
ease
are
the
fighting
violence?
ISIS.
Does the U.S. feel like it has a responsibility to help ease the violence and what's happening in East Ghouta? Is that seen as part of the mission?
Some of these things are things that we will not be able to talk about, okay? Some of these things will become intelligence matters and other issues as well.
Sounds like
Okay?
a no.
Pardon me?
That sounds like a
You
no.
cannot take that as a no. You cannot take that as a no.
Thank you.
Okay? Go ahead.
Last week I asked you, I'm sorry, I
Go
asked you
right
whether or
ahead.
not you
Go-
had a
Connor, hold
responsibility
on.
to
Go-
protect
Connor,
civilians
excuse
in
me.
Syria, though.
Excuse me, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Paul from AFP. You said that we have a whole range of options, and then you said, I don't know what else you expect us to do. So those don't square up, and there's like 400 people who have been bombed, who've been killed over the past few days.
We do have
And
a range of options.
What are those
When I
range of
say-
options,
hold on,
or what can
hold
you
on.
do?
When I say I don't know what you expect us to do, I don't know what you expect me to do here from this podium. Stop.
Diplomatic efforts are.
Elise, and some of these are private diplomatic conversations, okay? I'm not, enough of this already, because I already said UN Security Council resolutions, I've detailed those. I've detailed some of the conversations we've had with other governments. I've detailed our statements that we have provided, not just here at the State Department, but also the White House as well. So we are fully engaged. We have, as you know, a very large government with a lot of various departments, and we have a full range of options before us and ahead of us that we can use. It is not my position, not my role to be able to say what we will do. Some of those can be defined by other agencies that I can't speak to.
Okay, can I follow that up? Can you give us any information about whether there's a possibility at the UN to reach a ceasefire? What the Russians
I certainly hope there would be.
But what are the Russians asking for? What are they standing this up for?
I don't have all the details about what precisely the Russians are asking for in UN actions, but we have seen when Russia has tried to develop its own mechanism, like when they tried to develop their own mechanism for the equivalent of a joint investigative mechanism, they throw a wrench into it. With a joint investigative mechanism, for example, they wanted to give themselves the ability to veto it, to veto the decision by the new version of the joint investigative mechanism. So we're a little skeptical that Russia is going to be an honest broker in a UN-led ceasefire.
All right, everyone, I'm going to break in here really quick just to let you know that I do have a picture now of the live news conference happening here in Phoenix. We're going to be cutting to that the second it starts.
Backing as guilty of war crimes, but not in this specific case. In the case of Eastern Ghouta, do you find that Assad is guilty of war crimes?
Last I checked, I'm not a judge. That would be up for a court to decide, but certainly the crimes that he is accused of committing could potentially meet that standard.
Do you think he needs to be pursued to a court?
I'm not. That would be me creating policy, and I'm not in the position to create policy on behalf of the U.S. government. Okay, Lori.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on a topic Matt raised about Turkey, and the Wall Street Journal had a big report about how you're concerned that Turkey is drifting towards Iran and Russia. Is that correct? Are you concerned about Turkey's drift towards Russia and Iran?
Well, Turkey is a NATO partner of ours. They are a NATO ally of ours. We certainly have disagreements with the Turkish government. You know those disagreements just as well as I do. But we think that we have a relatively strong alliance with them and that we are NATO allies and partners. It is going to be natural that they will want to have relationships with other governments, and we're not going to step in between that, but I think we're confident in our relationship with Turkey.
Okay, let me ask you about Iraq. It's getting, you've described the terrible things that Russia is doing in Syria, and whether Russia's activity in Iraq would be benign. Iraq recently received Russian tanks, T-90 tanks, and it's reportedly considering the purchase of the S-400 air defense system. What is your comment on that? And would those transactions make Iraq susceptible to CAATSA sanctions?
Well, first of all, we are communicating with governments all around the world, such as Iraq and others, about the CAATSA law and making those governments aware of how they could run afoul of the CAATSA law and the potential repercussions as a result. So we've made it clear to many of the countries that we work with information about our new law. So I just want to be clear about that. Secondly, I don't know if this deal that you speak of is a done deal or not, so I'm not going to get ahead of what that may be, but I can just tell you that we make it clear with our partners and allies.
So it sounds like, from what you're saying, if this S-400 deal were to go ahead and be concluded, they could be in violation of CAATSA?
Look, that's a hypothetical, but we have made it clear to countries around the world, this is our law. This is what will cause your country, your government to run afoul of the law, and countries then need to make a choice.
Can I move on? Very quickly on Palestinian-Israeli issue. First of all, yesterday the Palestinians said that they would like to see the quartet expand to include countries like China and maybe India and other major countries. You oppose that?
You know, I think we discussed this the other day, that the United States, and we missed you the other day, by the way,
Right,
but the United States is committed to trying to assist with the peace process that will require the Palestinians and the Israelis coming together to work together on this. If it could be helpful, when the time is right, perhaps other countries could participate and help bring those two sides to the peace process. In terms of any kind of formal mechanism, I'm just not going to be able to address that today.
And one other
Because you like the quartet at 4 and don't want to make it an octet.
And we'd have to rename the whole thing. Then we'd have to rename the whole thing.
A non-et.
I'm not going to box in some of our people who are negotiating on these very things.
I have one more question. Please, let me just finish here. Today, the Israelis arrested a Palestinian man, Yassin Sradij, and they literally beat him to death after him being arrested. And earlier in the day, they demolished the homes in East Jerusalem. Is that, in your opinion, falls under war crimes? Could that be considered a war crime, considering that it is conducted by a military occupying force?
No, look, I've seen a report.
Right.
Just glanced at it. I've not seen the video. Is that the same answer as Matt earlier today? I've not seen the video. I'm not a judge. I'm not going to be able to make a determination about what happened.
Even the Israeli army acknowledged that. He died in their custody. They beat him to death. So, is that extrajudicial execution, in your opinion?
Look, Saeed, any issue where excessive force is used is always a concern of ours. I'm not saying it was. I've not seen the video. I'm not an investigator. I'm not involved in that process. We continue to call on the Israelis and Palestinians to do things that are constructive that can help bring both sides back to the peace table. Okay. Yeah. Hi, Jenny. Yeah.
Thank you. And South Korea and North Korea.
Okay.
I hope you answer these questions to me.
I will do my best.
Okay. North Korean's military commander, his name is Kim Young-chul, reportedly comes to South Korea for Olympic closing ceremony. He is the man who had led Cheonhan Navy ships and also Yeonpyeong Providence Island in South Korea. His provocations. So, and Kim Young-chul is currently subject to sanctions by United States and United Nations and South Korea. Will the U.S. allow this terrorist guy enter the South Korea?
Yeah, I think first we would hope that he would take the opportunity to go to that memorial. To go to the memorial and see what he is believed to have been responsible for. I think that was part of your question. Secondly, we have a close relationship, as you know, with the Republic of Korea. The Republic of Korea has worked with the United Nations to have various sanctions waived, to have certain individuals be able to visit their country during the Olympics. Our role in this is, working as a close partner and ally with the South Korean government. Also in supporting and ensuring a safe and good and positive Olympics. We've been very pleased with the Olympics, although we are rooting for our athletes to continue to try to grab on some of those golds. I don't have anything more for you on that, but I would just have to refer you back to the government of Korea on that matter.
But you have sanctions, United States, have sanctions. What are your opinions? I mean, U.S. Position of these guys coming to the...
we are in close coordination with the Republic of Korea, and this would fall under that. Just as it did when Kim Jong-un's sister came to South Korea for the beginning of the Olympic ceremonies.
But that's different.
And when other officials are.
This is military guy who was a terrorist guy, It's more. The U.S. said that U.S. never negotiation with any terrorist.
We're not involved in any conversations with the government of North Korea on this, okay?
On Iraq?
I can refer you to the government of Korea, and if I get anything more for you, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
On Iraq?
Okay.
On,
Abby, go right ahead.
This is on the report that came out regarding the upcoming human rights report.
Okay.